Hello, let's talk about occupational stress. This is chapter 16, highlights. Okay, so occupational stress is the combination of sources of stress at work, individual characteristics, and extra organizational stressors. And there are many different factors that are involved when it comes to occupational stress. Let's discuss some of those factors. Let's first look at the occupational stress model. And please do not memorize this model. You don't need to memorize it. Just want to take a look at what the occupational stress model looks like. So on this side of the model, we have all of our sources of stress at work. We'll get to those in more detail in just a moment. And depending on, where this stress is coming from at work, the way that stress is going to affect us is based on our individual characteristics. So how much anxiety or neuroticism, or if we have high or low tolerance for ambiguity, our personality traits, our personality type specifically, is going to determine whether or not we are going to have these symptoms of occupational stress. So these physical symptoms that we've discussed already in great detail, these physiological, emotional, and even behavioral symptoms that could be caused due to excessive stress. And then eventually, if we experience the stress long enough, we experience this physiological, emotional, and behavioral symptoms that can lead to disease. So specifically coronary heart disease and even mental health illnesses, specifically anxiety, depression, panic disorder. All right, let's talk about some specific factors of occupational stress. The first is organizational. So examples of organizational factors would be things like being laid off, or having to relocate to another area of the United States or even to another country to work, specific hiring policies, or let's say, maybe your plant or branch that you work at unexpectedly closes. Then we have psychological factors. So things like if you currently have a mental illness or if you have an addiction to something, this can also include ineffective coping skills specific to stress, and also poor communication skills. So if you have a really hard time asserting yourself. Then we have interpersonal. So interpersonal factors could be things like, maybe you've just become a parent for the first time, so you're juggling parenthood and your job. Maybe your family's gone through a divorce, there's a family conflict, or there's been an unexpected death or illness in the family. Our sociocultural factors, so experiencing racism, sexism, or maybe there are political changes going on in the office, or even outside in the real world, there are political changes going on, and military crises will also fall into this category. And then our biological, so things like if you suffer from a disease, some sort of ailment, maybe you have some sort of disability, whether it's visible or invisible. Maybe you've just become pregnant or you're having sleep issues. Okay, your work setting. So this includes your coworkers. Do you have fantastic coworkers that you work with, or do you have coworkers that you don't really get along with? This also includes ergonomics. So do you have a comfortable desk or chair area that you can work at? This also includes if you have any say in the decision-making process at your current job. And then finally, the physical and the environmental. So this includes things like if there's a lot of noise pollution, it's very noisy at your current place of work. There's poor lighting. You're exposed to toxic substances. Maybe you work in a really old building and there's asbestos in the ceiling. And this can also include poor air and climate. Maybe you work in a really hot environment and your bosses won't bother to get a new air conditioner or fix the air conditioner, so you're working in a really hot, uncomfortable climate. So why is occupational stress an issue? Occupational stress is important because individuals are going to spend many years, decades. This is a very large chunk of your life that you're going to be experiencing this occupational stress. And if you experience too much occupational stress, it can lead to hypertension, an increase in cholesterol levels, cardiovascular disease, bracing, which could then lead to musculoskeletal pain and problems, an ineffective immune system, so you might find yourself getting sick more often. And for some individuals, this might cause excess ingestion of alcohol. And for some, it could cause obesity, especially with stress eating and those type of coping mechanisms. So occupational stress can lead to, so for the employee, stress-related diseases, things that I've just mentioned, things that can contribute to an early death, can lead to unhappiness, substance abuse. And for the employer, it's going to be very, very expensive for the employer if their employees are constantly getting sick, they're using more sick days, and there's also going to be a high employee turnover rate. So employees are going to be quitting and looking for a new job that doesn't cause them as much stress. Okay, let's talk about control and demands. So this is a basic way to conceptualize what constitutes a stressful work environment because of the actual nature of the work. So we have psychological demands on the left here, control on the top. So if we have a lot of control and there's a very high demand for our job, we are going to experience high job satisfaction. If we see a low psychological demand and high control, that is going to be the least pathogenic. That is going to be the best type of job or the best type of outcome for us. We're not going to experience a lot of health-related issues from our occupational, or we won't even experience occupational stress at all. And then we have low psychological demand and low control. This is the second most pathogenic. And finally, if we experience, or if we have a job that has a very high psychological demand and we have very little control over our job, that is going to be the most pathogenic, and that is going to make us the most ill, the most sick. And for individuals that have, or they work in an environment where there is a very high psychological demand and have very low control over their job, they're putting in a lot of effort for very little reward, they are going to experience more heart problems, more back pain. They're going to be at 5 times greater risk for certain cancers. They're going to experience more infections, more mental health problems, more injuries, and more likely to abuse substances like alcohol and drugs. Okay, moving on to gender and occupational stress. So specifically talking about females in the workforce, sexual harassment is rampant, especially in occupation where there's definitely a male-dominated culture, specifically in the STEM field. A lot of stereotyping still goes on. A lot of women don't have many role models to look up to. There aren't, a lot of females specifically in those specific occupations. And then also females, there's a really big wage gap. And unfortunately, there's an even larger wage gap for minority women. And I'm going to show you all an example. So this is from the U.S. Census Bureau from 2019. And they're just looking at men and women here and racial and ethnic background. So what females were making compared to males. And we can even break it up by race, ethnicity here. So we can see that women are still making less money than men do, and it's even lower for women of color. Okay, let's talk about some specific occupational stressors or specific sources of occupational stress. So the two major occupational stressors are, well, the first is lack of participation in decision-making processes. So if your boss or your organization doesn't really, they just go ahead and make decisions on their own, and they don't really include you in that process, that can be a major source of occupational stress. And the second is role problems, and we have 4 different role problems: role overload, role insufficiency, role ambiguity, and role conflict. So for our role problems, we have role overload. And role overload is when the worker is given so much work that they can't cope with the amount of work that's been placed on them. They can't finish all of their work. They can't turn that work in. They are overwhelmed. Then we have role insufficiency, and that's where the employee will lack training, education, or experience that is needed for that specific occupation. And then we have role ambiguity, and that's where the employee isn't really sure of what their job really includes. Their job is unclear. And then finally, we have role conflict. So this employee has conflicting demands. Boss A is telling them you need to do X, Y, and Z, and then boss B says, no, that's not important. You need to be focusing on other things. And they're caught in a bind between those two supervisors. The workaholic. So this is an individual who excessively immerses themselves in work at the expense of non-work activities. Workaholics tend to identify themselves with their job role rather than as themselves as an individual. So if we have Sarah has worked really, really hard to become a doctor, and Sarah, that's how she identifies herself. She is a doctor. She doesn't think of herself as being anything or anyone else. And workaholics tend to experience something called burnout. So burnout is an adverse stress reaction to any kind of work with psychological, physiological, and behavioral components. Symptoms of burnout include having a diminished sense of humor, skipping rest and meals, and actually experiencing some weight loss is also common with burnout. Increased physical complaints, so feelings of tiredness and exhaustion, aches and pains. Social withdrawal, so you won't really want to be around others, you won't want to hang out with friends or family. Changed job performance, usually when an individual becomes burnt out, their job performance decreases. Self-medication, usually with alcohol or drugs. And then finally, personality changes. Okay, so these are the 5 stages of burnout. First is the honeymoon stage, and at this stage, the worker is satisfied with their job. Everything is going great. They are completely happy with their job. The second stage is fuel shortage. So now fatigue is starting to set in at work. They're starting to get a little tired. The third stage is chronic symptoms. This work is starting to lead to constant exhaustion. The fourth stage is crisis. So the worker stops attending work due to illness. So these chronic symptoms have gone on long enough, and now we can't go to work because we're sick. And then finally, that individual has hit the wall, and now they have physical and psychological issues that are now causing life-threatening illness. So how can we combat that? So when it comes to combating burnout, first we want to identify the value and meaning of your job. Do still find meaning in your job. Maybe you did at the beginning when you started, but maybe now a few years later, that's changed. So identify that. And if you can't identify the value and meaning of your job, that might be a sign that maybe we should start to pursue other avenues. Second, list activities that you like to do and rank them in order of importance. And once you do that, make sure you start doing them. So this includes, hobbies, self-care activities. Make sure you start doing that on a regular basis. Create a support group. So it doesn't have to be a support group in the traditional sense, but just as long as you have some sort of social support, whether it's with coworkers, friends outside of work, or family members. Start a self-care program. So do little things for yourself. It doesn't have to be every day, but every once in a while where, you do things just for you. Do things to take care of yourself that help you de-stress. And then finally, do something silly every day. Humor is an excellent way to de-stress. So whether it's listening to, like a comedy show or watching a silly episode of your favorite show on television, or just anything silly. Okay, so now a few general occupational stress interventions, making sure that we can achieve that work-life balance. So the first thing is, don't take work home. Some of us aren't that lucky, and we do have, or we will enter into occupations where we have to take work home. But if you have the option, please don't take work home, and try to keep those two entities completely separate from each other. While you are at work, make sure you take your rest breaks, the ones that you are mandated to take, your lunch break. And when you take your lunch break, make sure you don't eat lunch at your desk. So don't work through lunch. Give yourself that entire break to yourself. Go, if you have the option, if you can, and it's a beautiful sunny day, go eat lunch outside, but just kind of separate yourself for that 30 minutes to an hour away from work. Separate your self-worth from the task, because a lot of individuals tend to place a lot of importance on that task and on their that's connected to their self-worth. So if they don't do well with that specific task, then their self-worth is going to plummet. So we want to make sure we keep those two separate. Establish a techno-free time. Easier said than done, especially right now, but just give yourself an hour, a couple of hours, or even give yourself a specific, no phone time after 10 p.m. I'm not going to answer any emails starting after 10 p.m. at night, just so we don't get into that habit of using our phone and doing work things all the way until the late evening. Physiologically cope. So for the things that we cannot change and the things that we cannot use specific coping mechanisms with, using that emotion-focused coping or task-focused coping. If we can't change something, let's try to physiologically cope with exercise. And like I just mentioned, depending on the situation, the occupational stressor that you have encountered at work, make sure that you employ the appropriate style of coping. So using either emotion or task-focused coping. And that's it. That's occupational stress highlights.